The Soviets didn't just change history, they also changed history, in that they had an enormous influence on the study and craft itself, both in Russia and around the world. And in many ways, the influence of Soviet historians continues to the present. Much has been said about the history of the Soviet Union, but how is history written and taught in the Soviet Union? How did it change over time? How did Soviet ideology affect classic questions of Russian history before them? In this series on Soviet historiography, we'll see a brief overview of the major trends, important works, and the historians who wrote them. In doing so, we'll also see important background for videos going forward. The first question we'll answer is, how did Russian Marxist historiography come about? As in, the Marxist approach to history, specifically in Russia. What were its major influences and problems it sought to tackle? But first, let's back up for a moment and set the stage. By the mid-19th century, the field of Russian history was fast developing, often intertwined with emerging nationalism, as was the case across Europe. The country's historians were a small elite group concentrated in only a handful of universities, 11 total by 1917, and were often patronized by the state, seeing themselves as servitors of it. Chief among them was Sergei Soloviev and the State School, so named because they characterized Russian history as primarily the story of the state and the continuous process to its formation. By their lead, the field was also professionalizing. Important primary sources were being discovered or published for the first time. Archaeological work began, and academic journals were being created, moving history writing from an art to more of a science of national self-consciousness, as Soloviev put it. The state school tended to concentrate on political and legal institutions in history. While they moved away from the dynastic focus of the previous generation, they often still portrayed history as the actions of great men who could be viewed as building toward the present state. The role of the masses, meanwhile, tended to be deprioritized. This was especially the case with another prominent statist, Boris Chicherin, who outright declared, "The initiative of society in Russia has played an insignificant role." Likewise, Chicherin viewed things like serfdom and emancipation as top-down phenomena, in which it was the state which bestowed upon Russia its social classes. The state itself was above classes, what we could call the superclass state. And viewing the historical process as essentially rational and evolutionary, past events were considered unavoidable parts of natural development, which helped the people recognize the importance of a strong state. History itself was a continuous, organic progression. In this, the statists were primarily influenced by the works of Hegel, who had taken Russian academia by storm. But also from Hegel came the idea of a fundamental divide in character between East and West, creating unease over Russia's position like never before. Investigation into the past, it was thought, would reveal Russia's future, contributing to the larger debate between so-called Westernizers and Slavophiles, which racked the intelligentsia. More than just a political debate, these also became two opposing trends, or styles, in Russian historiography, which arguably have continued ever since. Those who described Russia as detached from modern Europe, in this case for the better, and those who saw Russia as the same as modern Europe, in this case lagging behind it. Scholarship on early Russian history became almost inseparable from the broader political implications posed by these two camps. Soloviev, for example, described a geographic clash between forest and steppe, Europe and Asia, as the essential content of Russian history. Threatened by outside colonization, a strong autocracy had to emerge to withstand the Asian threat. This, quote, constant and difficult struggle with the Asian barbarians ultimately ended in a clear triumph of Europe over Asia, allowing the Russian state to enjoy the fruits of Western civilization in full for the first time. In short, delaying, but not extinguishing, a turn from east to west. Another debate was over the so-called invitation of the Varangians. In many of those newly studied chronicles, they spoke of an event in the 9th century in which leaders apparently from Scandinavia were called to become princes over the Rus region. The significance and historicity of this event became a hotly debated question in scholarship. and you can see how it played into the East versus West debate. At one extreme, it was argued that the Varangians, as Germanic peoples, essentially created the Russian state and its culture, making it fundamentally European, or at least set it down that path. Others argued that the Slavs produced the state themselves, and merely hired Varangians to serve them, assuming the event occurred at all. And in either case, the history and legacy of this state, dubbed the Kievan Rus, was contested, being used to justify the all-Russian nation, as well as the opposite. Meanwhile, the last years of the Russian Empire were dominated by the students of Soloviev and his students' students, namely Vasily Klyuchevsky. He continued the line of thinking that the Russian state was essentially pushed into being by external threat, that the struggle for national existence caused the unification of Russia, and he popularized internationally what could be called the traditional scheme of Russian history, a continuum from the Byzantines to the Kievan Rus to Russia, with little to no room for outside influence. However, diverging from his predecessor, Klyuchevsky and his Moscow school brought the scope of historical study out of just individualized political history, incorporating other social and economic perspectives, and looking at how international commerce, production, and more contributed to the state that arose. Klyuchevsky's monograph on the Boyar Duma, in particular, in which he argued the economic interests of the boyars influenced how the early Russian state was organized, served as a sort of manifesto for this new socio-economic school of thought, and also had a profound influence on later Marxist historians. One of his students, Pavel Milyukov, the future leader of the cadets, called Klyuchevsky a bridge to the new style of history and his own economic materialism. Milyukov himself anticipated some later Marxist trends. For example, examining how Peter the Great's reforms had been compelled by economic necessity and internal evolution, rather than just the sole will of the Tsar. His generation of scholars, coming up in the period of reaction, and in light of the government's heavy-handed control over the universities, proved more radical than their predecessors. Elsewhere, as mentioned in a previous video, the Narodniks arose in the later half of the century. The Narodniks are a loose category, encompassing a varied set of beliefs, but in general, we can put the Narodniks in the non-West historiographical category, in that they viewed Russia as having particulars in history, which led to a non-Western approach to socialism. Forebears, like Nikolay Chernyshevsky, were clear Westernizers, but the classic Narodniks that came after tended to idealize a sort of special path for Russia. On the other hand, contrary to how they were later portrayed, the Narodniks shouldn't be regarded as the homegrown socialism oppositional to the new Western theories. In actuality, their beliefs were greatly informed by study of Western thought, in particular, Marx. Arguably, they came into being from Marxism, and ironically, were the ones who propelled Marx's ideas in Russia in the first place. So, to examine Russian Marxist historiography, we need to start here. At the root of their historical thinking was a belief in the so-called subjective criterion of truth, which essentially meant the following. Humans were the main unit of societies and their histories, and thus, history could be analyzed on a moral basis. Historiographical and sociological knowledge could never truly be objective, and the subjective factor, meaning people, could have a decisive role in the historical process. In other words, they rejected the notion of objective laws or predetermined paths to history. For them, it was people who gave any sort of meaning to history. People created the yardstick of progress, combined their efforts, and realized it. People could change historical trends. It was this, not merely the exact path of capitalism or socialism, that was at the heart of the Narodniks. Chernyshevsky, for example, who wasn't against Western development per se, argued that as societies were only collections of individuals, they were capable of influencing the path or type of development. In Russia's case, using the village communes and cultural contact with advanced countries to divert from or alter Western capitalism. And actually, this idea seems to have had a direct influence on Marx, changing his thinking later on. Likewise, Nikolay Mikhailovsky opposed the idea of historical necessity, of X objectively having to lead to Y. It was wrong to believe that what had happened in history had to have happened, or that later history was the objective goal of earlier history. History had no meaning in of itself. X and Y were just goals that individuals invented and then sought to realize. Contrary to Marx, Mikhailovsky also kept a firm barrier between what we now call the soft and hard sciences, positing that the former would necessarily always have a subjective element. Furthermore, Mikhailovsky was critical of so-called societal evolution, measured in growing complexity, namely the division of labor. Such progress was achieved through the fragmentation of the individual, and so was actually regressive to the richness and diversity of human life. He regarded the wholeness and welfare of the individual as a better criterion of progress. In effect, he independently arrived at what Marx called alienation in his unpublished work. From the subjective criterion, one can see how the trend of voluntarism emerged within the Narodnik line of thinking. As if individuals can affect the course of history, they should. As articulated in Pyotr Lavrov's historical letters, this was likely influenced by the idea, popular in Russian progressive circles, of there being a debt owed to the people, on whose suffering progress had thus far traded. The idea of progress being inevitable, automatic, and not requiring self-sacrifice clashed with this feeling of social guilt. It would merely justify an action and acceptance of injustice. In their writings, the Narodniks rejected great man history. They focused instead on the mass of individuals, not lone heroes, although they were accused of the contrary. Mikhailovsky, for example, was skeptical of supposed heroes, describing how alienated mobs were susceptible to a rational imitation of them. However, the subjective criterion also caused the Narodniks to tend toward the superclass notion of the state. For example, it could be argued that capitalism developing, or the commune surviving or not, had much to do with what policy the state chose to implement, rather than it happening inevitably. The Narodniks, and many of those descended from or adjacent to them, were each approaching the problem with the state as an important force in Russian history. Meanwhile, in came Marxism proper, and with it, Marxist historiography. This is, of course, applying the methods of Marx to the study of history. But as for how it developed in late imperial Russia, there are a few things to keep in mind. Something often underappreciated today is that much of Marx's writings were not published until much later, and even those that were published weren't always widely known, especially in Russia. Another thing is that Marx evolved in his beliefs over time, meaning it was a certain snapshot of his beliefs which were popularized in Russia initially. And third, Russian Marxist historiography was not divorced from the context of Russian historiography in general, and often was written in reference to, or drawing from, various autochthonous schools, as we'll see in a moment. Nor was there any sort of orthodoxy at first. Numerous ideas coexisted, with all the people to be discussed having an eclectic mix of influences. This is especially the case as Marxism came to Russia primarily as an economic doctrine, its philosophical underpinnings not yet well known or defined, in part due to the lack of material available. In fact, it was usually known simply as economic materialism, and so it was thought it needed to be supplemented by different philosophical and historical schools. But whatever the case, to put it in a sentence, the Marxist lens means examining history as the result of material, productive forces in the main, and with overarching changes developed through class conflict. The relations which people enter into, corresponding to productive forces, form the basis of society and generate conflicting class interests, which propel new developments. Elements of social consciousness, meanwhile, meaning politics, law, the state, functionally emerge in reflection of this basis, rather than being something innate. As mentioned, the Narodniks were inspired by Marx, and didn't see such a definition as necessarily contradictory with their beliefs. But this was complicated by the nomological emphasis also found in many of Marx's works of the 60s and 70s, meaning that they imply historical developments occur in accordance with inner hidden laws and with individuals dictated by their class interests. For example, the original preface to Capital spoke of natural laws and phases of development which cannot be skipped over. It was this sentiment which in 1877 Mikhailovsky took umbrage with, since it implied every society had to follow strict, historically determined stages, to which Marx wrote his often quoted Letter to Notes on the Fatherland, rejecting this view and clarifying that there was no universal scheme of history per se. But crucially, and this is what is usually left out, he never sent it. Likewise, the deterministic interpretation was bolstered by Engels, as in his 1875 polemic with Pyotr Tykaichov, for example, he suggested capitalism was indeed required, and after Marx's death, leaned more into the concept of laws and historical stages, including in Russia. Later on, in 1894, Engels affirmed that he and Marx had always thought capitalism was indeed required, and suggested that Marx's Fatherland letter, which by this time had been published, had been more tactical encouragement than actual theory. Unbeknownst to Engels, though, was another Marx letter to Vera Zasulich, in which in actuality, Marx showed much more ambivalence. The difference being, it was only with this letter that the survival of the communes was not preconditioned on socialist revolution first. However, this letter and the accompanying drafts were successfully hidden until 1924. Basically, as I'll explain in more detail another time, it's probable that both Marx and Engels did lean toward a more deterministic view at first, but then in the last several years of his life, Marx became less certain and came around to the Narodnik position somewhat. After Marx died, Engels remained certain, if not growing more so, and underrated any such shift on the part of Marx. Their Russian followers took up an even more certain position than Engels, given they were in a fierce polemic with the Narodniks. So in the end, Marxism became very associated with the objective laws of history argument, and the Narodniks the subjective. Regardless of what Marx may or may not have thought, this became the practical difference. And so, when Marxism first arrived in Russia, it was treated as a new westernizing import, a so-called scientific, objective approach, which proved Russia's capacity for transcendency on par with the West, and as such was adopted as a sort of panacea. For adherents of the Tatar yoke theory, Marxism seemed to imply an unexceptional, if perhaps convalescent view of Russian history, that Russia's backward Asiatic remnants from the Mongol days would inevitably dissolve away, that the backwardness could be fixed after all. So, for example, the person we could call the first Russian Marxist was aptly an economist named Nikolay Ziber, and in his writings, he described an evolutionary view of history in which societies naturally progressed in a certain direction. A fatalistic interpretation of Marxism in which there is an objective, unalterable path that people are powerless to affect was fairly common at first. So overall, compared to previous schools of thought, like the state school, we see some differences, but also potential similarities. Rather than history being the story of the state, which wills social classes into being, it is the state that is willed into being because of those social classes. The role of the individual is deprioritized in dictating the course of history, as individuals are governed by material circumstances themselves. But, similar to the old school, early Russian Marxism leaned into the idea of stages of history being progressive and inevitable, though toward a very different end result. Now, Russian Marxist historiography really came into its own in the 1890s, when prompted by battle with the Narodniks, they fully articulated their philosophy of history, and in many respects, it was simply the opposite of the Narodnik positions. Either way, this debate catalyzed the Marxists to look into Russia's past, and to identify the evidence for the emergence of capitalism, as well as previous stages. The first person I want to highlight is Georgy Plekhanov, the so-called father of Russian Marxism, because he, more than anyone else, laid out the theory of Marxist historiography in Russia, and also wrote a general history of the country toward the end of his life. Though originally upholding a Narodnik view, in the 1880s, Plekhanov fell firmly against them, arguing that recent Russian history showed the country was developing Western-style capitalism. On this, he wrote, I do not see any significant differences in Russian history from the history of the West. Capitalism in Russia would for the most part be no different than in England, and was already proving to be, he thought. Again, this seemed to imply the Marxists believed in a set universal scheme of history, of every country having to pass through the same stages, and so critics frequently attacked them for as much, citing the Fatherland letter right back at him. Plekhanov, however, agreed there was no universal scheme per se. Russia didn't have to become capitalist because all societies must, but rather the processes unfolding in Russia meant it would, at which point it was effectively on the Western road. In his view of history, the process of moving along any given path was governed by objective laws, and that couldn't be changed, but not necessarily the path itself, meaning capitalism wasn't guaranteed always, but should it start, and assuming it wasn't sufficiently countervailed, there was no reason to assume it wouldn't develop per the same laws thereafter. And for him, capitalism had definitely started. Secondly, Plekhanov sought to prove that capitalism wasn't just some alien importation to Russia, but rather developed out of its own socio-economic relations. In this, he pointed to the emancipation of 1861 as a crucial historical juncture, arguing it put Russia at a Western starting point. And unlike the state school, he interpreted emancipation not as some benevolent act by the Tsar, but the result of economic necessity forced upon him, after which the conditions of the emancipation and the breakup of the communes inevitably catalyzed capitalistic relations among the former serfs. As for the role of the individual, if history was just dictated by economic laws and change was inevitable, would our actions even matter? To this, Plekhanov affirmed that Marxism did give priority to productive forces in determining the trend of history, but he didn't deny individuals could influence the trend. For one thing, he argued that if anything was inevitable, it was only if humans carried it out, and he emphasized the role of society at large in doing so, writing, "No major step in mankind's historical advance can take place without the participation not merely of people, but of a vast multitude of people, i.e., the masses." Second, he clarified that Marxism didn't deny the existence of so-called great men, and in fact, we would expect that people with more material means should have more potential to affect change. But he argued that all these people were produced from and rooted in the socioeconomic environments of their time, and did not divert the overall trend. In all his work, he relied on comparative history, studying the laws of development elsewhere to inform the process in Russia. He, for example, rejected the potence of the bourgeoisie as leaders of the revolution based on the experience of 1848 in Western Europe. But this arguably led Plekhanov to have an inflated sense of prescience of what ought to happen. Western-style development, even if ostensibly not required, was clearly ideal for him. So in practice, he commonly fell back on arguments of inevitability and rational necessity after all, taking influence from Belinsky and Hegel especially. As has been a theme in the historiography so far, Plekhanov's view of Russian history was also conditioned by Eurocentrism and concerns of East versus West. Progress he described as Europeanization, holding a rather rigid, deterministic adherence to Western history, while Asiatic was frequently synonymous with backwards. In the mature version of his theory, seen in The History of Russian Social Thought, he came to describe Russian history as swinging between Asiatic and European socioeconomic formations, the old Muscovite Russia once having a completely Asiatic character. Building off Soloviev's geographic argument, he saw this state as forced into being since the time of the Mongols, and stagnating in part due to its environment. But more importantly, he saw the despotic state existing for so long because it was built upon an economic base of patriarchal communes, an inherently stagnant system because it did not produce dynamic classes within itself. People were dependent on the state, as there was no private property. This was a second type of commune, which the state had reimposed, like Baturin had said, but as a device to maximize extraction and perpetuate the existing system. Although Plekhanov argued the present state wasn't above classes when in the battle with the Narodniks, here he was saying the early Russian state was. This didn't make Russia special, however. To him, this just made Russia the same as China and other Oriental societies. Therefore, Plekhanov differed from the classic Mongol theory of the Mongols transferring the idea of despotism to Russia. Rather, Russia internally developed a certain mode of production to work around the Mongols, of the same type as China and elsewhere. But unlike those societies, Russia, under threat by its more advanced neighbors, had been in a position to borrow from Europe, and was forced into action by shocks such as the Crimean War, which set into motion development of more advanced economic relations, thus bringing Russia into civilized humanity. Therefore, Russia was out of the Asiatic black hole of stagnation mode, and now, by economic laws, was climbing the Western European ladder into capitalism and beyond. So in one sense, he accepted the existence of different historical paths, but Russia's path folded back into the main one. While many thinkers in this series will use racialized terms like Asiatic to describe Russian history, this is one of the more systematized manifestations. European and Asian were two distinct categories, practically meaning good and bad, respectively. And while ostensibly history wasn't required to follow the West, the desire for a Western, normal history was crucial to Plekhanov's understanding. Marxism, he thought, would finally complete the work of Peter the Great, though he also warned that this process was reversible, that Russia could fall back to politico-economic Chineseness, a charge he later levied at a certain protege. Elsewhere, Nikolay Rozhkov was arguably the first professional historian Marxist, rather than Marxist who wrote history. A student of Klyuchevsky, he was introduced to Marxism from Ziber and joined the Bolsheviks in 1905, though later switched to the Mensheviks. Marxist historiography he described as seeing politics as something functionally dependent on economics through the immediacy of class relations and the class conflict. Like many thinkers of his time, he was deeply influenced by major developments in the sciences, believing that any adequate social theory had to incorporate the best of the latest developments in human thought in general. For Rozhkov, history was a concrete science, which could and should be explained by an overall model, and so he focused on broadly understanding the economy, politics, and culture of human society rather than individual details in order to elucidate these laws of social development. He explained society in a mechanical way, with all developments causally determined by a hierarchy of different phenomena. Perhaps his most novel idea was that different economic systems produce different psychological types in history. The chief aspects of a society's culture was reflected in certain characters who emerged within it. In 1902, he produced one of the first general sketches of Russian history from a Marxist perspective, with his book, Town and Country in Russian History. Here, he asserted that Russia had developed feudalism not unlike Western Europe, and that trading contracts with England, monastic accumulation, and more created the conditions for early capitalism, taking wide advantage of new statistical research as well. Plus, in The Origin of Autocracy in Russia, he further asserted that economic crises in the medieval period was what had necessitated a strong government, adding an economic explanation to the existing classic theory. Another important figure was Peter Struve, who was initially an influential Marxist before drifting firmly into the liberal camp. Important in the battle against the Narodniks, he argued against the notion of a special path in Russian history, writing that it would be impossible to reconcile somehow the utopian faith in a unique economic development of Russia with the insight of Marx and Engels. He expanded on this in his influential 1894 book, Critical Notes, perhaps the first account of Marxist views legally published in Russia. Here, he decidedly criticized the role of the individual in history as part of the so-called subjective idealism of the Narodniks, instead calling the individual a sociologically insignificant category. Like Plekhanov, he argued that to move forward, Russia had to go through the school of capitalism. Yet, he also argued that the state existed outside of just class domination. and drawing from Ziber's evolutionary view, rejected the necessity of climactic social revolution. Critical Notes was an important example of adding a different philosophical base to Marxism, in this case, Kantian philosophy, with rejection of the Hegelian dialectic, which would become a major current going forward. In practical terms, this added to Struve's evolutionary view of social development, in which socialism grows out of capitalism instead of by overturning it. Struve was joined by the economist Mikhail Tugan-Baranovsky, notable for expanding on the work of Marx in regards to economic crises. His 1898 book, The Russian Factory, was particularly influential in Marxist circles, arguing that Russian capitalism developed naturally of its own initiative, and that such reformers as Peter the Great were dictated by Russian economic demands, not simply their own desires. Among the Bolsheviks was Nikolay Baturin, notable for his 1906 party history. At the time, one important historiographical question for the Marxists was how their movement related to and descended from those before them. Was Russian Marxism a natural evolution from Narodism, or unrelated entirely? Which faction had legitimate secession? And was the movement born out of the intelligentsia or the proletariat? Baturin, for his part, asserted that the Bolsheviks were in essence proletarian, resting on a labor movement that he dated back to the 1870s. Also from the Bolsheviks was Mikhail Olminsky. His 1910 book on the state in Russian history was a strong rebuke to the liberal concept of the superclass state, as well as a contraposition to Plekhanov, in that it argued the Russian autocracy was not a self-willed tyranny above the nobility, but a direct representation of the interests of the landowners as a class. However, Olminsky's work actually ran afoul of Lenin, who at the time was arguing against the odzavist tendency within the party, the people who wanted to eschew participation in the Duma. Reason being, Olminsky's strict class-based state, in which its administration was determined solely by class interest and directly an instrument of oppression, would imply it was absolutely futile to participate in it. Lenin, by contrast, began to emphasize some partial independence of the state machinery. Speaking of which, another influential historical thinker was Alexander Bogdanov of the Spiriotist faction. In his early years, Bogdanov produced a popular overview to Marxist history, the short course in economic science, which even Lenin was a fan of. But as with others we've seen, Bogdanov came to view Marxism as a scientific doctrine which needed more sufficient philosophical grounding. In this, he built upon Marx with influence from the works of Avenarius and Mach, two thinkers later lumped together as Imperio-criticism, creating a system that Bogdanov called Imperio-monism. Explaining these philosophies in full is outside the scope of this video, but in short, Imperio-criticism rejects the concept of the unknowable thing in itself, or absolute truth. Reality is identical with human experience of it. Starting from this idea, Bogdanov argued that truth was relative to one's type of social cooperation, because perception itself was a kind of social adaptation that developed historically. This he saw as the natural conclusion from Marx's famous line that consciousness is determined by social being. Likewise, this meant objectivity could not be based on individual experience. The criterion of absolute knowledge and physical being was socially recognized experience. So, while this philosophy was often misconstrued as the belief that reality doesn't exist outside of and independent of one's consciousness, this isn't really the case, or at least not the intention. Elsewhere, Bogdanov was especially drawn to Marx's idea of culture being a reflection of economic relations. He viewed this relationship like an organism that develops adaptations to its environment. So as a society outlives the conditions which gave rise to it, a new adaptation emerges and outperforms the old. When revolution came, the new ideology would already be prepared and would simply eliminate any remnants. Therefore, rather than the socioeconomic revolution being a precondition for cultural transformation, Bogdanov almost reversed this order. For this reason, he was highly interested in education and developing what he called proletarian culture, including the idea of the proletariat developing its own way of history to counterpoise bourgeois history. If this all wasn't worked out, proletarian culture would be ill-prepared to eliminate authoritarian and backward-minded thinking from the old age. These old ways of thinking would prevent cooperation and thus cause the revolution to degenerate. Bogdanov put his concepts into practice while teaching in worker circles and later at the party schools he helped establish, trying to cultivate an anti-authoritarian method of education. Schools, he thought, should be organized on a comradely basis, with students encouraged to question their lecturers, and the two bodies democratically deciding the school's curriculum and direction together. Though he fell out of political significance personally, through the Spiriak group, Bogdanov cultivated a talented group of thinkers dedicated to the advancement of proletarian culture. And as we'll see in future episodes, it was from this group that many of the heads of the Soviet arts and education first emerged. And finally, let's talk about Lenin. You've probably heard of this guy, but let's look at his legacy solely as a writer of history. The young Lenin followed much of the example set by Plekhanov, beginning with his work, What the Friends of the People Are. Here, he showed a similar view of history, for example, emphasizing the economic predetermination of social structure, rejecting the primacy of the individual, and affirming that history unfolded according to laws and in rigid stages, thus making the Narodnik idea of plucking individual elements from various social formations impossible. He rejected that there was a universal, mandatory scheme of history per se, but the question of capitalism being next for Russia was moot, since even more than Plekhanov, Lenin saw it as already established, a theme he further developed in his 1899 book, Development of Capitalism in Russia. He also used words like Asiatic on occasion, and spoke of capitalism breaking the peasants out of stagnation. But he soon came to differ from Plekhanov here, in that he didn't argue for a separate Asiatic period of history, instead viewing pre-capitalist Russia as essentially feudal. Friends of the People would actually even give a rough outline of when the transitions to feudalism and capitalism occurred, which, unbeknownst to him, would later problematically be used as a basis by many Soviet scholars. In Development of Capitalism as well, he examined how this capitalism came to predominance after the 1861 emancipation. However, he also began to see this as incomplete, in that it allowed some feudal relations to fester. At first, he proposed a minimal land seizure to account for this, but in the aughts, he revised his stance considerably, noting that they had underestimated just how feudal relations still were. He came to view the entire landlord economy and its landed estates as a feudal vestige impeding capitalist development. Though seemingly minor, these differing historical outlooks between Lenin and Plekhanov would have major political ramifications, especially at the Fourth Party Congress, over whether land should be nationalized or not. See, if Russia had been feudal, then nationalization of the land out of the hands of the feudal estates seemed the best way to kill those vestiges off for good. But if Russia had been Asiatic, in which it was precisely state control over land that had been disastrous, they couldn't afford to strengthen the state before Western-style classes were developed. It would only catalyze a backslide toward Oriental despotism. Further, Lenin came to disfavor the objective argument of history, showing much more distrust of presupposed schemes. History, for him, was told through the action of individuals, though their values were, conscious or otherwise, not divorced from social determinants. In so doing, he emphasized the class struggle aspect of capitalism over its economic development aspect, which is to say, it was the relations that were important, more than the productive forces necessarily being topped out. Meanwhile, from the notion of feudal elements being left over in capitalism, Lenin's analysis of recent history led him to identify two broad paths or types of capitalism, the Prussian and the American. The former involved the restructuring of society from above, combining the bourgeoisie with the old aristocracy. The latter, by contrast, was unfettered by feudal vestiges completely. Russia, though becoming capitalist, was of the Prussian type. The bourgeoisie, left to their own initiatives, seemed to be accommodating Tsarism, not replacing it, especially given the events of 1905. It was from this differing historical outlook that the Bolsheviks and Mensheviks began to crystallize based on actual material analysis. While both argued for a bourgeois revolution and also moved in the direction of peasant land reform, Lenin argued there were different kinds of bourgeois revolutions based on who were agents in it. The Mensheviks, in their willingness to work with liberals in dissolving the peasantry, were acquiescing to Prussian-style capitalism, and thus the aristocracy, and thus would be revolutionarily ineffectual. Lenin, by contrast, far from seeing the peasantry as the reactionary sack of potatoes, saw a developing struggle within the peasantry between petit bourgeois American capitalism and the landlord liberal Prussian capitalism, making the latter not actually progressive at all. Narodism, he contended, was the theoretical manifestation of the former. It was the more progressive insofar as it was the struggle against the feudal landlords, but it was reactionary in that it fought to maintain the petit bourgeois, delaying progress from going beyond that. Until then, they'd be allies against Prussian capitalism, in favor of free, relatively humane, American capitalism. This, by the way, was one of the many ways in which Russian thinkers of the time used or romanticized American history. Looking back later on, Lenin would describe the salvaging of this legitimate struggle out of the Narodnik tradition as the real prelude to Bolshevism. All that aside, Lenin was getting at a powerful idea here, one which actually anticipates a major theme in 20th century historiography, that historical transformations don't come in discrete patterns, nor in universal types, and that the survival of differing traditional elements in capitalism, what Lenin called Prussian-style development, may well be crucial to the character of 20th century politics. In arriving here, Lenin took the first steps in breaking Russian Marxist historiography out of a strictly Westernizer tradition, of measuring economic development only in terms of Western experience, even if still generally the same. But perhaps Lenin's most important contribution to historiography was to look at Russian developments in the context of a global system, not merely comparing Russia to the Western system, but as a part of it. By the turn of the century, he began to link the uneven development of capitalism in Russia to the country's interconnection with the global capitalist system, describing a center-peripheral relationship, which could also be applied to regions within Russia. Later on, and drawing from the works of contemporaries, this grew into Lenin's theory of imperialism, which has had an enormous influence ever since. While sure, Lenin's contribution may be overpronounced by the fact that it's Lenin, there's no denying his influence in how he succinctly repackaged, expanded, and popularized this approach going forward. In Lenin's view, a hierarchical world system of dependence had emerged through the exportation of capital from the most advanced countries to the periphery, extracting profits for the former. And so capitalism had to be understood as a transnational system, giving impetus to socialist revolution, not necessarily within the borders of the most economically advanced countries, but where the contradictions of the whole system were most pronounced. In addition to the political significance of this theory, Lenin's imperialism catalyzed or anticipated several historiographical trends, such as greater emphasis on the transnational perspective, both in how the country related to the West and how the Russian core related to its own periphery. Another thing from Lenin was the idea of stages of capitalism, or what became known as stage theory, in which there's qualitative transitions within capitalism. And at the same time, he further opened the door for flexibility in the macro sequence of history, depending on how development manifested. And so, numerous theories and ideas were developing in the pre-revolutionary milieu. Russian Marxist historiography developed out of these traditions, taking inspiration from the work of previous historians and also encompassing new ideas given the changing political environment. But then, the revolution broke out. How would the Bolsheviks coming to power change these ideas further?